To start off today's exclusive tutorial, here is a list of the colors as well as the paintbrushes I will be using in this painting. So the first step is to get your sketch down onto your canvas. So I used just a standard mechanical pencil and the grid method, and I got my sketch down onto my canvas. Once that is complete, we're going to go ahead and outline the most important areas of our sketch in some Mars Black paint with a small round paintbrush. And the reason why I do this is because I want to make sure as I get into complex layering of fur and colors that I maintain the anatomy of this cat to its proportions, and so that it looks like this person's cat and the reference that I'm following. So a very important step, a very simple step, but one that I have found really changed my painting process. Now, once that outline has dried, we're going to go ahead and tone our canvas. I'm going to take my large square brush. You can use whatever size or shape you prefer, depending on your canvas size. And I'm going to water down some burnt sienna and burnt umber paint together to create a very nice, soft, watery glaze. And this is essentially going to make our canvas much easier to see and work on. Sometimes that really bright white canvas can be a little daunting, a little confusing, and it just doesn't allow the colors to pop. So by toning our canvas beforehand, it really allows those beautiful colors and shades to pop right off the canvas. Just be sure to make your wash very, very light and translucent. We don't want this to be really thick or else we'll cover over that initial sketch. So once that layer has dried, we can go ahead now and start working on our background. Now I'm going to go ahead and use my large square brush for the majority of this section, and I've made a color combination of Mars Black, burnt umber, and titanium white together. And for this background, towards the bottom of it, I'm going to have the darker elements, so that will have more Mars Black in my mixture, and then I'm going to slowly add in an ombre of titanium white as we progress upwards towards the top left. I thought the pose of this cat really was so beautiful, the way that she is looking up towards the camera, and I wanted to illustrate a little bit of a glow and an ombre towards the top as well. It'll kind of reflect the lighting in her fur later on. So I'm just adding in titanium white to my mixture, and this section I am trying to work pretty quickly. With acrylic, as we know, it can dry very, very fast. So I'm adding in titanium white as I go and just trying to wet on wet blend this onto my canvas. Sometimes I get a little stuck trying to blend on my palette paper, and by the time I go back to my background, it is already dry. So I'm just trying to multitask, wet on wet blending directly onto the canvas, and we can adjust it or fix it later with multiple layers. So just keep that in mind. Something that I have found helpful in my own art journey is having a blender brush for this type of application as well. So to achieve that really nice, fine, smooth gradient background, using that blender brush to blend these 2-3 different colors together while they're still wet and tacky makes it so much easier than, let's say, the square brush that I am using. So keep that in mind. If you don't have a blender brush, this would be a perfect application for one for you to try. And let me tell you, it has changed my painting journey. So I'm a huge advocate. I did not want to have to invest in an airbrush machine, and the blender for me does the exact job that I needed without having to have that big of a cost. So just as a little tidbit and something that might be helpful for you if you're struggling to get a really nice blend. Now, once your background has dried, we can go ahead now and start working on what I consider the most important and the most enjoyable or fun part of this process. And that is going to be to get your base layers down onto your subject and to really create a nice base to work from. We are going to be doing a lot of layering today, and this layer, in my opinion, builds that foundation. So really work through this part very slowly and patiently. Now, I have opted for a medium-sized filbert brush, so between the 4 and the 6 range, and I'm just focusing on the large areas of color that I can see. So you can see in my reference here, I've got this beautiful white marking along the center of this cat's face, as well as down towards the shoulder and the neck area. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in first. This color is titanium white, Mars black, and burnt umber together, and it is a very soft, very, very light gray. So it is not entirely white, but it does have a little bit of that gray tone to it. And I'm just going in very slowly and blocking in the large chunks that I can see. And it's very important at this stage that I kind of force myself to use a bigger brush. I do not want to get really finicky and really too detailed too quickly. So for this section, I definitely encourage you to have a larger brush if possible and just focus on getting these large areas in. You can see that I'm kind of slowly starting to block in a little bit of the fuzz, but I'm not getting to the point where I'm drawing or painting individual hairs on this portrait. We will get there, but just not quite yet. Now, as you can see, I'm kind of working this color down and around this cat's face, and every so often, depending on the shadow or the highlight in the area, I'm adding a little bit more Mars black to darken up this color. I want it to indicate to my future self that there is a shadow in this area. We are essentially covering over this sketch as we speak, and so I have to have some sort of indication for my future brain that there is a shadow here, there is a fold here, or there is a clump of hair here. So I'm being very methodical with this. Not perfect. A lot of my paint strokes are very streaky, kind of chaotic in some areas, and I really just tell everyone my process and who watches my videos that this is essentially me drawing even further, but instead of a pencil, I'm now using paint. And I'm just giving myself a little bit of an indicator for later on when we get much more complex and involved. So just as we did with our white markings, I'm going to go ahead and block in the remainder of this cat with this beautiful smoky gray color. Now, I mixed this color by using Mars black, titanium white, and a little bit of burnt umber together to create this really nice, beautiful, smoky charcoal color. And I'm using the exact same brush, my filbert, size 4 or size 6, whatever size or shape you have, and I'm just going to go ahead and block in all the areas of gray that I can see. I'm being very careful around the eye area. Now, I've been doing this for quite a while, so I'm comfortable with my filbert brush. However, in these important areas, such as the eyes, you may want to scale down to a smaller brush, whatever fits your comfort zone so that you don't cover over any important areas like the eyes or the nose. So the next step is going to be adding in the base color for the darker area of this cat, which is in and around the shoulder area. So I'm going to use the exact same charcoal color mixture, my titanium white, Mars black, and burnt umber, but this time I'm going to add much more Mars black to this mixture. So it's not going to be straight black, but it is going to be pretty dark. And you'll see here that I'm just kind of blocking in the hair where I see the large clumps. I'm using the very thin section of the filbert, and that's why I really love the filbert so much, is they are so versatile. I'm able to use the large wide area to, like I'm doing now, fill in a large portion, and then I'm able to pivot on the fly to the thinner area and get the fur blocked in with a nice thin brush stroke. So a very versatile brush, and something that I really recommend for pet portraits and really any acrylic painting. But just go ahead and fill in the bottom section and just continue to add to those base layers. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to be doing a lot of layering today, and I found little areas that still needed a little bit of work, so I'm going to add in a secondary layer. So I'm taking that original sort of off-white gray color, but I'm adding in a little bit more Mars Black to create this darker looking gray. And this basically is going to work as an indicator for me, as I mentioned before, for shadows later on in the painting. So I'm being very haphazard with this and just blocking in the block of color that I see and the shadow that I see, and not necessarily worrying about the details. And you can see how already just by adding in this little pop of a shadow, or now this little bit of an addition of an extra highlight, really starts to make this piece come together and seem more cohesive and more like a puzzle fitting together than just all these separate blocks of color. So go ahead, work around your cat and your painting, blocking in these layers, and do as many base layers as you'd like until you have the shape and the look that you're going for. For this next step, we're going to go ahead and add in our base colors to the eyes and the nose. Now, the interior of this cat's eye is very similar to a dusty rose, so I'm going to go ahead and mix my cadmium red medium hue. I'm going to mix just a little bit of titanium white and a touch of Mars Black to create this really beautiful sort of deep rose color. Now, I'm using my extra small round brush, which normally for me is a 000, and I'm going in and filling in the under eye area on both sides of this cat's face with this color. Now for the far right section and the left eye, we're going to use the exact same color mixture. However, I'm going to add in a little bit extra titanium white, and in some areas a little bit more Mars Black to make this more on the gray pink side than it is being a dusty rose. And the reason being is because later on in the painting, when we get to the eyes, there's going to be a subtle shift in this skin. And so I want to remind myself that later on I'm going to have to define this even further. So by me having a block of color there, it serves as this reminder. And you'll see here that when I start to work on the left-hand side compared to the right, you will see a big difference depending on the sort of breed of the cat that you're painting, or if you're following along, you may choose to add this into your own painting or adjust it accordingly. But you can really see here the difference, and that is just me adding in some Mars Black to make this more on the gray side. Now, once you have that inner sort of flesh color down, we're going to go ahead and work on the rest of the eye now. So to start off, I'm mixing my phthalo blue, cadmium yellow medium hue, and a little bit of titanium white together to create this really nice sort of bright, vibrant, minty color. And the reason why I chose this is because I wanted a base color that was sort of right in the middle. It wasn't too dark, but it wasn't too light, and it allowed me to work in both shadows and highlights on top of it. So that is why I chose this color. It does look very, very bright, but we are going to dull and soften it in certain areas. So I'm taking a small filbert brush. You can use whichever you prefer, round, filbert, a small square would work well as well. And we're just going to go ahead and fill this area in one swift base layer. I'm going to work on both eyes simultaneously. I want to make sure that they are both even and accurate in both of their colors and that they match accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and just go right on to the other side and fill that section in as well. So once those cat's eyes have dried, we can go ahead now and start to fill in the base color for the cat's nose, as well as the pupils. Now, based on my reference, I have decided to use Mars Black and titanium white together to create a really dark 80% gray. Depending on your reference, of course, this color may change, but I'm going to go ahead and fill in this entire area in the nose, as well as both of the pupils at the same time. This basically just saves me productivity. I can go ahead and get all of these layers down and allow them to dry together. All right, so once that has dried, we're going to go ahead and start what I think is the absolute best part of any painting, and that is getting the eyes detailed and completed. I'm going to go ahead and start with the canvas right-hand eye, and I'm going to use my 000 brush, the smallest one I have available, and I'm going to take that green, that original base green that we created, and I'm going to add in more blue and a little bit more yellow to darken this color. So I have kind of removed the titanium white from it by adding in a lot more blue and a lot more yellow. Now I'm going to go ahead and follow my reference and really start to block in the areas of darkness or shadow and detail within this eye. So you can see here that I'm kind of doing a little bit of a spidery type motion. Eyes very up close, look like spider webs, very sort of detailed and sort of sporadic, lots of different veins and things in all sorts of directions. And the quality of this photograph for my reference allowed me to see those details. So this was very exciting for me to paint. At times, sometimes I am given pet portrait references that are older, the camera is not as great, and so you kind of lose that information. So this was very exciting. Now I'm going to continue doing these spider web brushstrokes all around this eye and really just start to build up those initial layers. And this is actually going to build the shape and the roundness of the eye and the realism as well. So you can see here, and what I find helpful is kind of changing my color mixture every time my brush leaves my canvas and goes back to my palette paper. So I'm taking that original dark shadow green, but in some areas I'm adding in titanium white. Some areas I'm adding in a little bit more blue to get on the blue side. I want this eye to be authentic, but I want it also to not be very stagnant and boring. So I'm really trying to switch up these colors, really kind of play with light and shadow, and just adjust them ever so slightly. You can see on the right-hand side, I've gone a little bit more blue. Follow your reference and really dissect the colors that you're seeing and add them in slowly. It is much easier to layer that way and kind of do a little bit at a time than realize you've gone too far with one color and have to backtrack. So once that has dried, we're going to go ahead and add in a secondary layer of our spider lines. Now I've taken my original dark green color that we've been using, and I've gone ahead and added in some cadmium yellow and in some areas burnt umber. So I wanted to take that dark shadow color from forest green to a more warm, tangy olive green, if that makes any sense at all. Basically, just add in some more yellow to your mixture and switch it up a little bit. This cat along the bottom of their eye towards the fleshy part had a sort of dark stroke along the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and use this olive green down in that area. And then I'm also going to add in some extra lines throughout just to continue to build up the detail. Now, once those layers have dried, we're going to go ahead and work on another layer. Now, this is going to be building up our shadows. So I'm taking that dark olive color and I'm going to add even more Mars Black to it. Now, a word of caution, we don't want to go too far into Mars Black, so we want to make sure we add a little bit of Mars Black at a time to our color mixture. You want to be able to see that green still on your palette paper or your palette, whatever you're mixing your colors on. You still want to be able to see that green quality to it. Now, what we're going to do is we are also going to add in a little bit of water to create a glaze. I don't want to go ahead right into this dark color and cover over all of our hard work. So I have found glazing to be the best option. So add in some water and we're going to lightly start to layer this dark shadow color up around the top of this cat's eye. Now remember, cats' eyes are round, and so we want to make sure that we implement and indicate this shape in our painting. So you can see that I'm kind of curving these shadows along the top of the eye, following the outline that we've already created, and kind of working around the pupil area. I'm going to do a nice thin brush stroke all along the bottom, and you can see already just by adding this tiny little stroke, we can really start to see the shape be defined and kind of where we're going with the eye of the outline and the overall look. Now, once your shadow layers have dried, we're going to go ahead and start adding in some highlights. So we finally get to add in some highlights and some life to this eye. Now I'm going to go ahead and start with cadmium yellow and titanium white together. And I'm going to use my small round brush and just slowly start to add in the sort of areas or blocks of colors that I can see that are highlighted. Now on my reference, the bottom of the eye was very well lit, so this is going to add and have a lot more yellow than, let's say, the top of the eye. Just be sure to follow our curve that we've kind of blocked in already, so we really kind of define that shape even further, and be very selective of where you put these highlights. So no matter the color, no matter your reference, you do want to make sure that you leave some of those greens, some of those darker olive colors to shine through. We don't want to cover over all of our hard work, and you're going to hear me say that throughout this entire painting process and in all of my other videos, because I know it is so easy to just bring in all of the highlights. It starts to look so good and we just get a little carried away. So be mindful of where you're putting this and how much. Now this next section is essentially the same as our cadmium yellow, what we just did, but I'm going to go ahead and add in some blue. I noticed in my reference that this cat's eye had a little slight tone of blue to it, so I'm just going to go ahead and add in some phthalo blue, titanium white, and just a touch of yellow to create this really nice soft robin egg blue. I'm going to be very selective of where I put this with just some dots and dashes and very small brush strokes, and just kind of work my way around the eye, adding this in very selectively. All right, so once those layers have dried, I'm going to go ahead now and start working on tidying up the outline and the pupil of this cat's eye. Now, I apologize in advance. I did not realize my big fat head was in the way. So hopefully you guys can still see. Hopefully it's not distracting and my camera stays in focus. I apologize. I didn't realize I was that close. But essentially, I am taking my 000 round and I am dunking right into Mars Black. Now, what I find helpful for this is adding in a little touch of water, very, very minimal, to just liquefy that paint a little bit and make it easier to paint in a curve. So I'm essentially going around the entire oval, the entire outline of this cat's eye, and just tidying it up a little bit. Sometimes I find when I'm working within that eye, I want to get the colors and the blending correctly, that I go over that outline. And so that's why in the very beginning of this painting, I always paint that outline first, so I can always remember the size and the anatomy of the eyeball. Now I'm going in doing the exact same thing with the pupil, just making sure that the size is correct and that it looks nice and clean. Depending on your reference, it may be a little fuzzy. The pupil may not be as defined. You can totally change and adjust this as you go. But for me, I like a nice sort of clean, fine line. Now, this next part in the eye painting can be a little stressful, but fear not, we are going to tackle this together. So I'm going to take my large blender brush, my small blender, and a very, very tiny filbert brush, and I'm going to go ahead and work on what I call my shadow glaze in this cat's eye. So we're going to take our Mars Black paint and a lot of water, and we are going to slowly work 1, 2, 3 layers of shadows up towards the top of this cat's oval eye. So kind of in and around the pupil, down towards the sides, we're just going to go ahead and work in this shadow. Now you want to make sure that your paint is pretty translucent. I would recommend doing more layers than you think needed, just so we avoid covering over all of our hard work. The thinner the layer, the more that we can add, and we can kind of adjust it as we go. We don't kind of dive right into a very, very dark paint, unless of course you're confident and the area is quite dark, then I say go for it. But just keep that in mind. Now, a big piece of advice for this section as well, or really any time that you glaze, is to have paper towels, a cloth, a dishcloth at the ready off on the side. And the reason being is, and as you can see here, I'm picking up some of this black paint that I think might be a little bit too opaque, a little bit too dark for that area. I'll come in with just a wet brush, so no paint on it at all, and I will kind of pick up some of that glaze and then dry it off onto the paper towel. So I'm kind of subtracting, a little bit like watercolor, I'm kind of subtracting that glaze from the area and lightening it up. So always have that, at the ready on the side is maybe a little bit of paper towel, or even sometimes a dry brush will work for that as well. So just keep that in mind. But we're gonna go ahead and kind of glaze in and around this eyeball, any areas that I think need to be darkened where I do not wanna mix a new color. So this is an excellent purpose and an excellent thing to do with glazing, is actually making new colors and new textures and a new appearance on your canvas without having to mix any new colors or do any of the hard work. So that is my biggest thing for this section, is to just take it slow, work on your glazing techniques, and really use them to your advantage to create a really nice three-dimensional eyeball. Now, once all of your glazing layers have dried, we can go ahead now and start to finish the last colors that are seen in this eyeball, so your final top layer. Now, the bottom of this cat's eye had a beautiful sort of coppery burnt sienna color. So I'm taking my burnt sienna straight from the tube and my very small 000 brush, and I'm just going in and adding in some of these spider-like brush strokes in this color down towards the bottom. Now, the brown is very slight, so I'm wanting to be very selective and kind of avoid a lot of the other areas we've already painted. So I don't want to cover over all of the bottom half with burnt sienna. I just want to be very selective. Once I'm happy with how the burnt sienna looks and I'm comfortable with how much there is there, I'm going to go ahead and add in the last sort of yellow-green highlights. So I'm taking a very light green, so phthalo blue and cadmium yellow together, and titanium white, and I'm just going in and adding in any highlights where I think they may be missing. So this is not quite our big catch light yet, but it is going to be the lightest areas I can see within this eye. I always like to go in and add them in again after I do all of my glazing. Sometimes our glazing is not accurate. A lot of times it very much so feels like watercolor where it's hard to control. So if I do feel as though my glaze has gone too far into other areas or things are just a little bit dull and too soft, I will go in and add in all of these pops of color. Now, while I've been blabbing here, we can go ahead and start what I think is the most important aspect of painting eyes, and that is going to be the catch light. This is what brings your painting to life and really starts to give your subject a feel or a mood or emotion. So this is what is going to connect with the viewer and is incredibly important. So what I'm doing is I'm starting with my 000 round brush, and I've started with a 50% gray. Now, I like to do it in stages, so I like to start around 50% and add in more titanium white as I go. So I don't want to jump right into titanium white, very similar to our glazing with the eye. I don't want to jump into something that is super, super opaque, and then it starts to look a little cartoonish, or it starts to look a little fake. If we have a nice gradient, a little bit of like an ombre effect in the catch light, following the curve of the eye in our reference, you can really make a beautiful, realistic catch light. So if you'd like to try it in stages, let me know what you think and if it works for you. And of course, if you have another system of doing this, please by all means go ahead and do what works for you. I've started with the basic shape in this 50% gray, and once I'm confident with the size and the shape, what I like to do is start to add in more titanium white. So you can see here I've lightened that gray, and I'm adding in a little bit of a stroke on these sort of outside edges and towards the center as well, just filling in some of this detail and where that lightness starts to increase. Now, the last step for this eye is to add in the eyelash reflections. So I'm taking my Mars Black paint and my thin liner brush, and I'm just going ahead and adding those in. Now, the next part in our painting is to go ahead and get that second eye completed. Now, I am trying to keep in mind with these full tutorials that many different artists have different learning styles. And so for this secondary eye, I'm going to go ahead and have no voiceover, but the painting being completed in a more real-time and less cropped version. So I really tried to keep in as much as possible. So there may be some little pauses in between where I'm just mixing paints or looking at my reference, but I wanted to include a very verbal, sort of auditory explanation for the first eye and a more visual explanation for the second. So I hope you find both helpful, and whichever style works for you, I hope that you enjoy. I'll see you at the end of this eyeball where we will start to begin the fur. Enjoy! Now, once your eyes have dried, we can go ahead and start working on the next step in our painting. And that is going to be to get the base layer of the fur down onto this cat subject. Now, to start off with fur, I always prefer to work from dark to light, back to front. So I'm going to look at my reference and I'm going to digest all of the dark areas that I can see in this section. That could be skin folds, it could be markings in the fur, maybe the lighting conditions where there's a harsh shadow on your subject's face. We're going to digest and take all of these factors into consideration. Now, I've chosen to use my small or medium filbert brush and a color combination of Mars Black and Titanium White together. So this is going to be around a 70 to 80% gray. It is a very dark charcoal color. And I'm taking my small filbert and I'm going to go ahead and mark in all of the darkest areas of the fur that I can see. Now, filberts work wonderfully for this as they have kind of a dual purpose. So a filbert, when it is flat, can create a really nice rounded, chunky, flat line. And on its top or the tip of the brush, it can make a really nice fine line. So I find filberts work wonderfully for fur texture. So if you have not used the filbert brush, I definitely encourage you to give it a go and let me know what you think. It became one of my favorite brushes. But enough chit chat, we're going to go ahead and start using these tiny little paint flicks to create the look and feel of the beginning of this fur. And you can see that I'm being very selective with this. I'm just going around certain areas, blocking in really dark chunks and following my light source. That is the biggest piece of advice, and one of the many that I can give for painting fur, is really watch your light source and really just be selective. We don't want to go in with this really dark color and cover over our base layer. Our base layer is there for a purpose. We put it there for a reason. We want fur to have many different layers, your midtone, your base, your shadow, your highlight. So really keep that in mind as you're working through this cat painting to leave that base layer to shine through, and just be very selective with your brush of where you put these tiny little brush marks. Something to consider as well, and as I'm doing this voiceover that just popped into my head, every artist is different. So if you like to do all of your shadows at once, please go ahead and do that first before you start this step. I work in a very weird, strange puzzle piece type way where I finish one section at a time, and I know that may not work with every artist. So do what works for you and then jump back to this section for the next step. Now, what I'm doing is I'm taking my small and medium filbert brushes, as I did before, and I took that original base gray and I added in some titanium white. So I'm adding in lightness to this color. So I'm lightening this up probably about maybe 5 to 10%, very, very minimally. And I'm going in over top and I'm adding in what I like to say is a softening layer. So I've picked a kind of ratty filbert brush, something that's really quite old. This is back from when I first started painting, and it really works for creating nice, soft, very blendable layers. And I'm just going in and I'm adding in these brush strokes over where, kind of our base layers are, but I'm leaving some of that base layer and the shadow to shine through and adding in this new layer over top. Now, something to be said about fur as well, aside from being very selective, the next piece of advice I would say, and something that still to this day tests me, is making sure that I paint my fur in all different directions. So as I'm planning these layers, and that's really what we're doing, is we're planning this fur, we're planning these layers, I'm being conscious of making my brush strokes go in all different directions. So you can see here at the top, I'm kind of putting these little brush strokes every which way, left, middle, right, depending on how the fur is growing and how it appears in the reference. A lot of times it is very easy to become too rigid, too uniform, where everything is going the same way. It looks clean, it feels natural, it looks nice to us as we are painting it, but a lot of times it really does subtract from the realism. So if you were trying to make a realistic portrait that is very close to your reference, you're going to want to make sure you implement this. Take your brush, Take your time, load it up with that paint, and really look at your reference. Is the hair growing outwards to the left? Is it following the curve of the eye? Is it down towards the chin? Is it crisscross? Is it messy? All of these things I like to ask myself, and depending on the animal that you're painting, a house cat fur may be much more tidy and clean than, let's say, a tiger out in the jungle who's just had a fresh kill or a swim in a lake or something. All of these factors are going to change the fur, the look, and the direction. All right, once those layers have dried, I'm going to take a very light gray, so Mars black and a lot of titanium white together, and I'm going to go ahead and work on slowly starting to block in the shape and the look of the muzzle of this cat, as well as the space between the eyes. I'm going to take my small or medium filbert, which, as you can tell already, is one of my favorites, and I'm just going to go ahead and slowly start to add in these details and continue to flesh out the anatomy and the look of this cat's face. Once you are feeling good about the layers you have completed so far, we're going to go ahead now and repeat the exact same process but on the other side of this cat's face. Now, depending on how you paint and how you've been following along today, you're either going to continue on with this video as is and follow step by step, or if you've done all of the shadows at once, all of the midtone and the highlights at once, you may have to scrub through just a little bit to find your next step of where you are in the painting. But just remember, we're going to repeat everything we just did and sort of mirror it for the other side. Now, the next step in our painting, once you have both sides of the face completed, we can go ahead and start what I like to call the refining stage. Now, the refining stage is exactly that. We're going to use the layers that we have completed so far and a much smaller, tighter brush, and we're going to go ahead and add in even more detail. Now, this is going to be the stage that brings this painting to life, and you really start to see it come together. It is absolutely my favorite stage and one that takes the longest and the most effort, in my opinion, but is well worth the wait. Now, I'm going in with my small round brush. Normally for my refining, I usually will use 2 brushes simultaneously. So I will change them in and out depending on the area. And I will use my 000 round or my fine liner. So my liner brush in an extra small. And these are going to allow me to have the tightest, most finest brush strokes possible. Now I'm going in with a much darker gray. I am using Mars Black and Titanium White together, and this is going to be like a 90-95% gray. This is really quite dark, and the reason being is around the eye area on this particular cat subject, it had very dark shadows and almost like these very fine eyelash lines. I'm not entirely sure, just these really long, beautiful sort of Mars Black meets charcoal gray lines. So I'm going ahead and adding those in. You may find them on your portrait, but you may not, depending on the breed and the cat and the age. I'm sure all of these different factors, but I went ahead and added those in around the eye just to build up that eye area even further. What I have noticed with my paintings and what I have found to be successful with building fur layers is taking this refining layer and really focusing on the layers underneath. And what I mean by that is, for example, I am refining the shadows right now. And what I'm doing is I'm finding all of the shadow layers that have popped through and remained from our previous layering with our shadows, our midtones, a little bit of a highlight. I'm finding those darker shadow areas and I'm just refining them further with some tiny, tighter brush strokes. So I maybe am adding some hairs that are a little wayward, maybe some areas have gotten a little bit too light and need a little bit more fur direction, or maybe a shadow needs to be darkened because I've taken it too light. So that's really what I'm focusing on at this stage in the painting, is adding in these tighter brush strokes, darkening any areas that may need to be darkened, and just continuing to build on the realism of this fur. The more layers in your fur, the better, in my opinion. Although it takes forever, it is really, really quite effective towards the end of the painting when you have 7, 8, 9 different layers of different values and shapes and sizes. So just keep that in mind. All right, so once that has dried, I'm going to go ahead and work on the inner corner or the fleshy area of this eye. Now, I'm going to be working with my 000 round brush, and I'm going to be using 2 to 3 different colors to complete this section. So first, I'm going to start with a sort of middle tone gray. And if I remember correctly, this is very similar to the gray we mixed for our fur layer, our mid-tone. And I'm going to go ahead and block in the largest chunks of gray that I can see. Now, to this day, mixing red and pink and gray together is such a weird combination. To me, it feels like it won't work, but it does. So if you feel very uncomfortable or awkward at this stage, like I'm going to cover over all of this beautiful pink color with this gray, if this is completed and included in your portrait, just you're on the right track. I felt the exact same way of, this is weird, this doesn't feel like it would work. So if you feel those things, you're on the right track. But I'm basically filling this bottom section with this gray color. I'm going to kind of add in some areas as well, titanium white to my gray to lighten this up a little bit. So it's a glossy, fleshy eye. Just remember that. It sounds so gross, but it's a glossy, fleshy eye that is glistening. It is wet, with those like tear ducts. And again, I'm not a scientist. I am not anatomically correct when talking about this, but this is how my artist brain works. I'm sure there's tear ducts and wetness and glossiness in this area. So the more blending, the more gradient or the more ombre this looks, the better. Add in some titanium white, just as I'm doing here. Blend this out into the far left corner. And then we're going to come in with an even brighter titanium white for our highlights. So I would pre-mix these three colors on your palette: a darker gray, a sort of middle tone gray, and then a highlight, which is like a little bit of pink and gray mixed together with titanium white. Use all of these colors throughout, and you can see here that I'm going to repeat the same kind of concept with the eyeball, with veins and spider-like brush marks. It's kind of the same exact concept, just a little bit smoother and less detailed. So keep that in mind. This may or may not be in your portrait altogether. If you are painting a gray cat but using this tutorial for assistance in fur, you can omit this step. If you're following along, you can create this however you prefer and whatever you feel looks best for your painting. All right, so the next step for this portrait is we're going to go ahead and start working on the refining stage for the middle tones and the highlights. This is going to be done in the exact same way that we refined our darker shadow layers, using our 000 round and our liner brush interchangeably. Now, normally for this stage, I will have 3 to 4 different tones of gray mixed, pre-done on my palette. And the reason being is I try not to waste time remixing colors or trying to find the right color. I try to do it beforehand. Now, a lot of you may be thinking, okay, great, Cassie, that's wonderful. However, my paint dries very quickly on my palette, and there is a way around this. 2 options. Number 1, actually, there's probably 3. Number 1 is I like to use a palette paper with some mixing white mixed into the colors that I'm making. And this will bulk up the quantity of paint on your palette, allowing it to dry slower. The flatter or thinner your acrylic is, the much faster it will dry. So by having these large clumps of pre-mixed paint on your palette, it will dry slower. You can also use some slow drying mediums if you want to add to your paint as well, spritzing it with a mister bottle to keep them wet and moist, or if you want to use a stay wet palette, which usually has a sponge or some sort of wet material inside, this will also keep your paint sort of wet, pliable, and still usable for your painting. So those are some options for you, but I always try to pre-mix 3 to 4 different colors and use those methods to keep them viable. Now I'm going ahead and doing many different layers of these 3 to 4 different colors. I'm keeping in mind that I'm wanting to increase the lightness slowly. So I'm going to start with that middle tone gray and slowly add in titanium white as I go. So really 4 different colors of gray, getting lighter each time. Now you can see here that I'm just being very selective in and around the face. We're going to add a lot of different highlights, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using different shapes and sizes and thin or thickness of brush strokes for each time. The small rounds I find make a much more thicker brush stroke, so I kind of tend to use that first, and then I will go in with my liner brush at the very end to get those really fine wispy hairs. All right, so the next step in our painting is to go ahead and start moving down towards the right side of the face, down towards the cheek and the shoulder area. Now, I know in this area, the fur becomes much longer, much more dense, and a little bit more uniform, so not as many wild directions. And I'm going to achieve this look by using my small round brush and my liner interchangeably, just as we did before, but I'm going to change the way that I paint and the way that I am using my brush strokes and the brush itself. So I'm going to use much more what I call pen pressure or brush pressure, and I'm going to drag this brush with a lot more force down the canvas in these larger chunks. So I'm using the brush and the way that it fans out with more pressure from my hand to create these really nice, long, beautiful hairs. And you'll see here a big difference once I get these hairs down and you start to see it come to life. You will see the difference between the tiny little tight brush strokes around the eyes, around the top of the forehead, towards those really long, beautiful hairs down towards the chin and the cheek area. So just remember, as you work through this section, use more force on your hand, fan out those brush bristles, really push down and get a nice thick brush stroke. So while that is drying, I'm going to go ahead now and add in another base layer to the muzzle and the center of this cat's forehead. Now I'm using my small or medium filbert brush with titanium white and a touch of Mars black. This is going to be like a 10% gray, very, very light and on the white side. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in this area and kind of clean it up a little bit. You can see my original base layer was just a very muted gray. And I know towards the end of this painting, this area gets very, very well lit and very white because of this cat's markings. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in now, as I want to slowly start to blend this center part and the right side that we've already completed together. So I'm just kind of working this puzzle, kind of filling in the pieces and slowly start to blend all of these different aspects together. So once you're done using your filbert brush and you have the majority of that 10% gray down onto your canvas, what I like to do next is I like to take my liner brush and I like to load it up with that exact same paint color and slowly integrate and blend this center section into the canvas right side of our cat's face. So the side we've already completed. That is the only issue sometimes with working in this puzzle piece type way, is that if you do not catch it, sometimes your paintings can look like it is completed in sections, exactly how we're doing it. We have to make sure that we are conscious of blending these sections together to make one singular blended painting. So by using my liner brush and this 10% gray, I'm overlapping into some of the right side of the cat's face. So by the eye, down towards the sort of cheek and muzzle area, I'm just having a few wayward brush strokes blend in over top of that gray and really just layer together. So be sure to make sure that you blend, that you seamlessly connect these areas. Depending on your cat, it may look different from this one, but really making sure that you blend these areas together to make one cohesive face. All right, now this next step could have a lesson all in itself, but we're going to cover a little bit today, and that is glazing. So I'm taking my large blender brush and I've just watered down burnt sienna with a lot of water. So you're going to see this really soft coppery color. Now I'm going over top of all of this gray that we've just completed. Make sure it is dry before you do this step, otherwise it will mix together. But I'm just going ahead and lightly adding in this very soft watered down layer over top. Now you're going to see as it dries and as I continue to layer, it adds in this little secondary color to the gray and to the white. Not every cat or every species is perfectly gray, white, or black. If you're doing anything with sort of monochrome colors, you will notice a little undertone, whether it is blue, whether it is burnt sienna, a little bit of burnt umber. It's just never perfectly gray, black, or white. And so I've decided, based on my reference, that I'm going to add in some burnt sienna, and I do very little at a time. So I am just lightly washing this over, and if I feel as though I have gone too dark with this color, it's a little bit too vibrant for my liking, you can always water it down with some more water, have a paper towel or a towel on hand to dab it off, or use a dry or wet blender to kind of really help blend and mix that all together, lighten it, and remove some of the saturation. Now I'm going over top of our glazing once it has dried with my liner brush and my lightest highlight. And I'm just going to go over top and sort of bring back some of those clear highlights, none that are toned with burnt sienna, just a little bit back into the painting. A lot of times glazing will really soften all of your edges. And if you don't want your piece to be too soft and too blended, you can always bring in a brush and a stroke over top and just bring back some of that highlight. All right, so once that has dried, I'm going to go ahead now and start on the canvas right ear. Now I'm starting with my small or medium filbert, and I'm just gonna go ahead and mix a color combination that is a dusty rose, and that is cadmium red, a little touch of cadmium yellow, titanium white, and some burnt umber to make this really dark, dusty red color. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in the entire base of this ear with this color and allow it to dry. Once that has completely dried, we can go ahead now and start to work on the depth of this inner ear. Now I'm using my large blender brush and I'm taking that original base ear color, but I'm adding in cadmium red and some Mars black together, and of course a lot of water to water this down. We want this to be translucent, our glaze. We don't want it to be too dark too soon, so I like to do a bunch of different layers to achieve the look that I'm going for. But basically I am just going ahead and starting to block in this sort of weird, strange pattern, depth, and sort of wrinkliness that pet ears have on the inside. We all know what, the inner cat ear and the inner dog ear kind of has these weird folds and wrinkles. So I'm really just trying to work on that look and to achieve the depth with that shadow. So you may have to add in more Mars black or less Mars black to your mixture depending on how visible the inner ear is. If there's a lot of hair there, it might not be as clear, and so change that depending on your subject matter and your reference. Now, while that ear is drying, I'm going to switch gears here and switch over to the mouth and the bridge of the nose. So I'm keeping my productivity up and we are going to switch to another section while that is drying. Now, I apologize for whatever reason, this section of the footage did not work. For whatever reason, it was just missing. So I've been having problems with my camera and it went and got fixed actually throughout this tutorial. And so I think this may have been when the footage started going bad. But what I did was I'm using my liner brush with probably about 3 different grays, a sort of middle tone gray, a lighter gray, and then white. And I'm just slowly blocking in the area of where the whiskers will be on the mouth, as well as working on some of the more base details on the nose. I'm just kind of filling in this gap so that as I work towards the left side of the face, this area is already completed. So I apologize that some may be missing. Again, you can stop or pause the video at any time. So if you want to kind of look and see how I've done it, please go ahead, but basically I'm just slowly starting to block in the areas of the whiskers, and we'll detail it later, but that for whatever reason it just got a little messy, so I apologize. But hopefully you can kind of fill in the gaps yourself using your reference and we can get caught up together. All right, and the last bit of this section is going to be filling in the area between the eyes with our 10% gray. So I'm going ahead and I'm using our small and medium filbert with our 10% gray, and I'm just going to go in and fill this all in as a base layer. All right, so now we can go ahead and start working on our ear, so our second layers. And basically what I'm doing is I'm taking my small filbert brush and my original base layer that I created, the color that I created for this ear, and I'm going to use it in its opaque form. So I'm not going to use it as a glaze. I'm going to essentially remix this color and use it straight as paint. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in some areas of this ear that I want to be quite opaque, and then I'm going to create 2 other color variations of this color. One is going to be a lighter variation, so I'm going to mix it with titanium white to lighten that shade, and then I'm also going to have a darker variation, which I will add Mars black to, or more burnt umber, and that will be my darker value. And from there, I'm going to really work on building the shape and the depth and the texture of this ear using those 3 colors. So you can see here that I'm kind of going back and forth, really blending wet on my actual canvas itself, and slowly starting to build the pockets and the folds of this cat's ear. Now, these, I will admit, I have always had issues with painting ears. I just could never get the look and feel right. And so even to this day, you can see that I'm kind of really being very cautious, careful, and methodical with this. So don't feel bad or discouraged if the first time you paint this cat's ear, it is a total flop. If you have to cover over it with that base color again and start over, you would not believe how many times I've had to do that in my art career. So do not get discouraged. Now I'm going in with my dark shadow color, so that darker variation of our dusty rose, and I'm going in and finding all the deepest, darkest pockets of this ear and using this color there. And just by these 3 colors alone, you can really start to see the shape and the definition come forth on the canvas. Once the inside of your ear has dried, we can go ahead now and blend this ear element into the rest of our painting. So remember, we want everything to be seamless and one piece. So how are we going to do that? Basically, what I like to do is I like to take my liner brush, and I have all of the grays that I mixed for the original fur color, that right side of the face, ready to go on my palette. And essentially, I'm going to rinse and repeat the fur technique, but extend it above and over top of that inner ear. So I'm dragging these brush strokes to the right in different directions, making sure that they look natural and a little bit messy. A lot of times pets' ears, they have a lot of crazy hairs going on. So if you have some going every which way, I say the more the merrier. But I'm going to drag this hair over top of that inner ear and just really work on blending it together. Start with your middle tone grays, add in maybe some darker shadows, some darker sort of gray tones to that as well. We don't want it to be all one color. And then lastly, come in over top with that highlight and blend in to your light source and the look and feel of the fur itself. Just be very selective, again, where you put those furs, and just really start to blend it and add it to the rest of the painting. The next step is to go ahead and paint in all of these dainty little beautiful hairs over top of this cat's ear. Now, how I go about doing this is I use my extra small liner brush, and I use about a 50% gray to get started. So Mars Black and Titanium White together, 50%, and I like to water it down just a little bit. So we are not watering this down to a glaze, but we do want to make sure that our brush is nice and wet and we can dunk right into that paint afterwards. And this will allow us to create the thinnest, daintiest, most accurate line possible with this brush. And what I'm doing is I'm basically just doing a guideline at first. So I'm keeping all of these hairs about the same width, and I'm just going in and blocking in and focusing on the direction. So are the hairs curving downwards? Are they going upwards? How many are there? Are they crisscrossing? All of these things I am thinking about during this stage. Now, it can feel very daunting because we are covering over all of our hard work of that inner ear, but it was important to do that first so that it will shine through. There's no way that all of these hairs are going to cover over it entirely, so seeing that information behind it is incredibly important. You can see here I'm taking my time. I'm being very, very slow and methodical with this, and I'm also not worrying about if my lines are pinpoint or sharp. Sometimes we want to make sure that we have these nice soft lines in there as well, maybe lines that break off or skip over the canvas. It kind of makes a really cool effect and helps with the softness that these inner ear hairs have. Now, this next step, we're going to do a little bit of highlighting around the painting that we've already completed. So I'm taking my medium-sized filbert in Titanium White. It's about 10% gray, so a little bit of Mars Black, very similar to the color we used for the center of this cat's face. And I'm just going to go ahead and start to block in the shoulder area with a larger base layer. And essentially, I'm not really working here yet, but because we are slowly moving our way down towards the sort of chest and shoulder area, I wanted to get this base layer in first. So I'm just going in and blocking that all in, getting it ready for the next step. In addition to adding white to the shoulder, I'm going to go ahead and really integrate this forehead into the rest of the painting. So I'm taking my very thin liner brush and my titanium white paint, and I'm just doing a light little paint flick here and there towards the top of the head. I'm really making sure that, again, I integrate it into those gray areas. And if you need to add any shadows or midtones to kind of adjust the shape of this marking or make it any smaller or larger, please go ahead and do that now. We're going to take the exact same titanium white paint and the exact same paintbrush, our thin liner, and we're going to go ahead and add some variation to the fur on this cat's ear. Now, up until now, we have left this gray fur alone, but I want to add a little bit more bulk and a little bit of variation to the way that it looks. So I'm being very selective. I've kind of added a little bit of water to my paintbrush as well to really thin out this white paint so that it applies smoothly and very sort of daintily and gently. So I'm just very selectively tapping my brush very, very slowly and cautiously over these hairs, adding bulk in certain areas. Now, depending on your cat, you can make this as light or as dark as you prefer, depending on what you're seeing in your reference. But you can see here, I'm just slowly adding these long, very wispy brush strokes to this ear, and already just a little bit of titanium white really brings this ear forward, makes it pop, and it becomes a part of the painting, almost as if it matches those other highlights we've done around this cat and brings it all together. As I mentioned earlier in this tutorial, I'm really trying to be accessible to all learning styles. And so for this next part of the painting process, the cat's left side of the face, I'm going to go ahead and provide some easy listening music and omit my sometimes screechy, very annoying constant voiceover. And that way, every single person who watches this tutorial has an option of how to learn it. So I hope you find this visual helpful, and I will see you guys at the end of this portion where we will begin the whiskers and slowly start to work down towards the body of this cat. Enjoy, and don't forget, if you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments below, and I would be more than happy to answer them, as well as your feedback and comments. They of course go a long way in helping me as an educator and a content creator, and of course I just love to hear from you. So I'll see you in a couple minutes. When it comes to doing fine details in my paintings, like eyebrow hairs or whiskers, there are two tools that I use simultaneously that make the experience so much easier. First and foremost, I use the Molotow acrylic pump marker as my base. And this essentially is a giant gel pen, but it is filled with white paint. You can choose the color, but I have chosen white for today in a fine point for our whiskers. And this is a huge time saver for me as I have pretty shaky hands, and a lot of times my liner brush work, just as is for whiskers and whatnot, tends to be a little bit on the shaky side and the not smooth side. And so this was an excellent tool to use. You can see here I'm going to get a very nice, opaque, beautiful line, strong line, which I like. And this allows me to have much more control and say over where my line is going. And so I start off with this base. I will draw in my bold lines that I can see with my marker. And then the part two comes in with the liner brush. So I will make sure that my liner brush is nice and damp, and I will go in and sort of fade out the edges of the beginning and the end of the line. A lot of times I find that this marker is very start-stop. There is not the ability, because it is just a pen nib and not a brush tip, there's really no ability to fade it out as is on its own. So that's where this second brush comes into play. If you don't have an acrylic pump marker, fear not, you can still paint whiskers and eyebrow hairs, no problem. What I would do is what I'm doing here. So I'm going to make sure that my brush is nice and damp. I'm going to go ahead and dunk right into my titanium white and kind of just smush it around on my palette a little bit. So we want a nice mixture of water to paint ratio. And then I'm going to jump right in and just paint those lines as is. Now, if you have a shaky hand like me, make sure you have some wet paper towel close by or even your water container, because acrylic, although it does dry quickly, you do have the option to jump in and erase a line if it is still wet. So fear not if you accidentally go a little wayward with your lines like me, or they're a little crooked, or they just don't look right, you can go ahead and actually erase them before they dry. So just keep some water or paper towel or a wet cloth handy in case that happens. But either way, between the liner and your titanium white paint, or if you want to try the marker, you can try that too. They are excellent tools for creating really fine, bold lines for your whiskers and your eyebrow hairs. So the next step, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and work on the shadow that is being cast underneath this cat's face. Now, this cat in the photograph is looking up into our light source, and so there is a nice shadow down below under the chin and in the neck area. So I'm going to use two different brushes, my liner brush as well as a filbert brush, and I'm mixing a color combination of Mars Black, titanium white, and some burnt sienna and burnt umber together. So I want this to be a little bit more of a warmer tone, so that's why we're adding in those browns. And I'm just going to go ahead and slowly start to block in all the areas of shadow that I can see. This is going to feel very similar to the process that we did before with the face, just now we're using a much larger brush as these clumps of hair are going to be bigger and more clumped together and less detailed. So we do want to make sure that we're not stuck using the same brush over and over again, and that we do change to something larger if the area permits it for you to do so. You can see that I'm kind of using the side of this paintbrush as well, and this is exactly where that filbert comes into play and is such a superstar with fur painting, is you can really turn the brush sideways and get a really nice, thick sort of chunky brush stroke and then kind of taper it off into something that is so thin and so dainty towards the end. And there's really no other way to explain it other than just watch this and look closely at how that brush is behaving. I've done hundreds of what I feel like hours of tutorial work, and I can never find a way to describe it other than please just look and see how amazing this brush is and all of the capabilities of the brush strokes. Now, depending on your light source and your cat subject, you may have to darken these areas further. If you are going to go ahead and darken this shadow up further, I would recommend using burnt umber or Mars Black and kind of playing around accordingly with how dark you want your shadow and how drastic you want it to be. Now, while I've been blabbing on and on about filbert brushes, what I've done here is I'm taking my small and medium filbert, and I've taken that shadow color that we created, the Mars Black with the burnt umber and the titanium white, and what I did was I added in more titanium white to it and started blocking in the lighter clumps of hair above those shadow layers. So not all of this cat's neck is going to be heavily shadowed in the same brown-black color. So I just went in and added in a little bit of a highlight and a shine detail to the bottom of the neck with my filbert and that light color mixture. So the next step, once those layers have dried, is I'm going to go ahead and mix Mars Black and titanium white together to create a 50 to 60, 70% gray. And this is going to be to slowly block in the shape of this cat's mouth. It's open just a little bit where that, the lips kind of meet the chin. So we're going to block that in. And then once you have that completed, we're going to start working on the darkest aspects of this cat's nose. And this is done with Mars Black straight out of the tube. So I'm going around this nose, and because we've been painting around it this entire time, sometimes the shape gets a little disfigured, sometimes I paint over things. So I just want to make sure that I have the proper shape and size to this cat's nose before I start detailing it. And I will do that all with my 000 round and Mars Black together. So you can see I've kind of covered in those nostrils a little bit. I'm working on the edges, making sure everything is clean and tidy. And then of course, adding in a little bit of shadow towards the split in the middle. So once that layer has dried, we can go ahead now and start working on the detailing of this cat's nose. Now, how I go about doing this is normally I will mix 5 to 6 different shades of gray on my palette, and I will lighten them about 10 to 15% each time. So we're going to want to have 5 to 6 different colors varying in lightness. And from there, what I'll do is I will start with the darkest gray, and I will slowly start to build up these little layers of stippling. Now, stippling is when you create art with dots, and I thought this worked perfectly for painting noses, whether they are dogs or cats, anything with this sort of leathery, bumpy texture, this seems to work really well for it. So I'm just taking my 000 round brush and some light gray paint, and I'm just going ahead and blocking in all of these dots that I can see. It is very tedious at times, depending on how big you are painting, but right away, even just 1 to 2 layers of dots, you can already see the texture and the form of this nose starting to take shape. Now, once those layers have dried, normally the last stage in my nose paintings, I will usually just come in with a spot highlight, so a very light gray, and I will selectively add in a few dots in the brightest areas. Now, what I like to do next is I like to go ahead and add in some more refining details to the neck fur. So I'm going to go ahead and use titanium white, Mars Black, and a little bit of burnt sienna together to create this really nice warm gray tone. I'm using my liner brush in extra small, my superstar, and I'm just going ahead and adding in some finer details to the neck, and of course going to eventually hit the bottom of the chin. Now, the purpose of these layers is what we did with the face. We're going to refine the area a little bit further. Now, with the neck and the body, you will notice that I paint it a little bit differently. I don't get as nitpicky with the details. I tend to keep things a little bit wider, a little bit thicker, and a little bit more clumped together. And the reason being is because the photograph, that area is a little bit more blended and a little bit more out of focus. So I'm trying to replicate that in my painting as well. I'm going ahead with the exact same color now and my liner brush and my round, and I'm just going to go ahead and block in this hair on the chin as well. And you'll see exactly here why we do our dark to light and our back to front. You can see here that I'm painting over those initial sort of shadow under the chin layers with now the layers above it, which is a lighter chin hair. So it's all about learning how to play with your layers and which areas to paint first, so that we're not kind of double backing and, doing the same area twice, 3 times over to get it right. I'm taking my Mars Black paint and a little touch of titanium white and my small round, and I'm just going in and defining this we'll call it a smile. I'm defining this smile on this beautiful cat a little bit further. Up until now, it has been very sort of muted, very sort of gray, and I wanted to give it a little bit more definition. In addition to that, now we're kind of refining all over. And again, I apologize for bouncing around, but keeping my productivity high. I'm using my small round brush and a 10 to 20% gray. It is very, very light. And I'm adding in some markings just above the nose. So oftentimes on cats, whether they are big cats or house cats, you'll see that a lot of times they have very sort of sparse fur towards the nose, where the fur sort of kind of changes into that leathery nose pattern. We're going to add a little bit of markings to indicate that. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. Very little stippling dots, very tight, small brush strokes, very similar to ones we used on the face. I'm going ahead and I'm adding those in up and around the nose area just to define it further and seamlessly blend our nose. Keyword blend and seamless, and kind of making it cohesive between the nose and the other elements of our painting. So the next step in our painting is going to be to work on the neck and the shoulder area of this cat. Now, this particular breed has a lot of very swoopy, clumpy, fuzzy hair down on the neck and the shoulder. And so I thought that the large filbert would be the perfect brush to achieve this look. I want to keep the bottom half of this portrait a little bit more blended and soft and much more definitive towards the top of the face. So that's why I'm choosing to use this really nice large filbert brush with a color combination of titanium white, Mars Black, and a little touch of burnt umber to warm up that color just a little bit. Put it into the warm tones rather than just being a little bit neutral. It's important as well, and you can see here that I'm adding variation to my colors as well. So I'm making sure that in some areas it's a little bit darker, following any folds or any sort of fur clumps that I'm seeing. Just as we did the face, we want to do the exact same thing to the body as well. And this is kind of the part of the painting where you can let go a little bit. So we've been very rigid, very definitive towards the face, wanting to make sure that we get that likeness for our client or whoever may be receiving this portrait. But now towards the bottom, we can kind of express ourselves a little bit. And you'll see here that, you can see actually in the top right, I do have my reference open and out. But a lot of times I was just kind of painting with feeling. Yes, I'm following the reference to make sure that it looks like my client's pet, but I really just wanted to have fun and make this cat so fluffy and majestic and beautiful that I kind of strayed from it a little bit, and it was kind of nice. So I encourage you to, and especially in this section, unwind a little bit, unclench your jaw, relax your shoulders. We've done the hardest part, and now is the fun of creating this clumpy fur. So once those layers have dried, we can go ahead now and start to work on defining this area just a little bit further and separating it from the rest of the body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my extra small liner brush and my small liner brush later on, that's going to be a step larger, and I'm going to go ahead and add in these varying shades of gray around the bottom of the neck area. So where you see this kind of defined line where I'm painting now, I'm going to go ahead around those areas and just define them further. So I'm adding in a little bit of a highlight, brightening some areas where I feel as though it may have gotten a little bit too dark, and really working on blending this neck area into the rest of the portrait. So you will see later on that I start to go into the canvas right side by that darker gray as well, and just blend that over top of that titanium white area. So we want to make sure that this cat portrait does not look like 3 sections as it does now: the head, the neck, and the sort of shoulder and back area. We want to make sure it is all blended together and looks like one painting. And that's what I'm really working on right now before I move any further down towards the bottom of the canvas. Once those layers have dried, I can go ahead now and start working my way down towards the front of the neck of this cat portrait. Now, I know this section is pretty much almost pure white, so I can go ahead right away and jump right into my titanium white. I don't have to do as many layers as we did before. I'm pretty confident jumping right into a more opaque, pretty straightforward color. So I'm taking this small liner brush. You can use the extra small as well, or whatever brush you have on hand. A filbert and a round would work wonderfully. And I'm just going to go ahead and block in, and sorry for my head being in the way. I'm going to go ahead and block in these larger chunks of hair. And you can see here that I'm going into the neck in some areas. Now that those layers have dried, I can see some areas that need to be lightened and blended a little bit better than I have previously. So I'm just going to go ahead and use these large sweeping brush strokes using the full width of this liner brush and its capabilities. So the larger and thicker that liner brush, the wider, broader those strokes will be. So that's why I've jumped up to the small liner instead of the extra small to get a little bit of width. So I want to keep that chunkiness. I want to keep it a little bit more blended, less refined, and that brush is going to help me do so. So once those white fur layers have dried, we can go ahead now and take whatever brush you are using for your glazing. In this case, I'm using my blender brushes, one wet with the glaze and one dry. And I'm going to go ahead and glaze in some shadow and texture to this fur area. Now, what can happen sometimes if you leave the white fur just white and opaque as is, it can fall a little flat in comparison to the rest of the portrait we've completed so far. So by adding in a very light gray glaze, it does create a little bit of depth and dimension to this fur. You can see here already, we're kind of insinuating to the viewer that there is a shadow here. There is a little bit of a skin fold, maybe where the collar would sit on your pet portrait. And so I'm just wanting to indicate this with a slight glaze. And I have found this to be the most effective way of doing this. And you can control it much more this way rather than having to mix the color opaquely yourself. So it allows you to do this shadow and this depth in stages rather than jumping right in. So go ahead and add your glaze as little or as much as you would like to. Once your glazing has dried, we're going to go ahead and add in some of the final highlights in this area so far. And these are going to be the lightest areas we can see. So my extra small liner brush is now loaded up with my titanium white, and I'm just going along the bottom of the neck and what will be the chest area with this really bright white opaque titanium white. Now, I like to do this after glazing, as sometimes with glazing, it can be a little splotchy. Because you are using wet, sort of translucent paint over opaque paint layers, it can kind of dry a little funny, especially if your canvas is textured. So I always like to come in with a bit of a layer over top just to smooth things over in certain areas. So I'm not wanting to cover over everything, as I've been mentioning throughout this entire video. We don't want to cover over everything, but I do want to be selective. So take your brush, whether it's an extra small round or a liner brush, and just go ahead and add in these titanium white areas. Now, once your titanium white is done and you are feeling good about it, I do also like to mix a very light gray or middle tone gray and add in some depth in the shadows where I feel necessary. So you will see that I kind of pick out certain areas in the fur that maybe they need to have a little bit more dimension to it or a little bit more chunk to it. And so I will go ahead and add those in afterwards. And you'll see me create all of this, but it's kind of like a two-step process for me at this point. I glaze, and then I come in over top with a more opaque layer of a middle tone color and a highlight color, and I use both of them very interchangeably to create some more dimension and really finish off the fur effect. Once that layer has dried, we're going to go ahead and block in the shadow underneath it. And that is going to be with Mars Black, Titanium White, and Burnt Sienna together to warm up that gray a little bit. And I'm just going to go ahead and using my medium filbert block in this layer underneath of the white area we just completed. I'm not going to do anything further with this layer just yet as I want it to be fully dried, but I do want to go ahead and start thinking ahead of my layering as we finish up this portrait. So this needs to be completed first before we can do any more detailing. So go ahead and get that put in. Now, the best part about acrylic is while that layer is drying, I can go ahead and work on something else. And so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to finish off this cat's face. And the final step in any portrait for me is to add in the whiskers. So I'm going to use the exact same steps I used for the eyebrow hairs with my Molotow acrylic pump marker in white, my extra small liner brush, and my blender to create this effect. Now, the only difference is that the volume or the quantity of whiskers is going to be much more in this area than just the few sparse ones we had up towards the top of the head. Now, I'm going to start and find all of the largest whiskers I can and block those in with my marker. I like to start there as I don't want all of my whiskers to look the same. It can be very easy to draw or paint these whiskers in the same direction, the same length, and just the same overall look. But by starting first with my marker and tackling those really long, thicker whiskers first, it just causes and really creates a nice depth and dynamic to it. So start off with your marker if you have one or a thicker liner and find all the big thick whiskers you can. From there, you can go ahead and add in these small wispy ones over top or on the side, depending on where they're located, and you can really sort of build up the quantity and the layering of these whiskers. Now, what I like to do also at the end is blend in my whiskers just as we did before with wet liner brush or my blender brush, just to make them seem a little bit more realistic and a part of the painting. I don't just want them to look dropped onto this cat's face. Now, once you have the canvas left side of the whiskers complete, we're going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the canvas right. So the same process applies. You are essentially just going to mirror these steps. Now, once you have those whiskers completed, we're going to go ahead and essentially finish the bottom of this neck. Now, where those beautiful brown gray tones have dried, I'm going to take my extra small and my small liner brush and titanium white paint, and I'm going to go ahead and block in all of this fur texture. Now, with this section of the painting, I want to keep this fur really chunky and really clumped together. I'm going to use the really large, wide angle or wide side of this liner brush and a lot of pen pressure to really fan out these beautiful chunks of fur. You can see in certain areas that I'm really pressing down onto this canvas, and that is what I found worked the best for me. Now, if you don't have a liner brush, you can achieve this exact same look by using a filbert and the same amount of pressure. It's really going to create that beautiful, tapered, sort of rounded clump of fur that I think just really works perfectly for this painting. Now, the last step in our painting is to go ahead and finish the back or the shoulder area of this cat portrait. Now, using my medium or large filbert brush, depending on the size of your canvas, I would use either or. I've mixed a color combination of Mars Black and a touch of titanium white together. This color is the darkest we've used on this portrait so far, aside from the nose. And I'm going to go ahead and block in the largest clumps of hair that I can see in this section. I am being very, very selective with this. I do not want to cover over all of that charcoal gray, but I do want to have it more heavily shadowed than any aspect or any element of this painting so far. I am using the brush, and this is the excellent part about the filbert. I am using the sort of side of this brush and a little half moon or a little bit of a swoop to the side to create this fur effect. This is long, clumpy, very sort of dense fur, and by using this brush and that little bit of a paint flick really creates this effect with minimal effort. Once those layers have dried, I'm going to go ahead now and start adding in some details. So using the same size filbert brush I used before, I'm going to lighten that color up now with titanium white so that it is just a shade lighter than the original base. You can see here that it is just ever so slightly lighter, and that is because I want to make sure that I do this in stages and I don't go too light so that it looks like spots or stripes on this cat portrait. I'm just using the same paint flicks, that little tiny C with the pen pressure of my hand on my canvas, and I'm just going around and adding in little highlights to this fur. Now you can see here in some areas I will even add in titanium white even further, and I'm using a wet on wet technique to actually blend it in on the canvas. And this is actually something new to my techniques or to my videos lately, is I don't do a lot of wet on wet blending. Normally I rely heavily on color mixing and glazing. So this was something new for me as well, and I hope you find it helpful. But it was really cool to blend this in on the canvas and kind of not have such a harsh highlight. It worked really well for having a little bit more of a blurry effect or something that's a little bit out of focus, which is exactly what we were looking for. You'll remember I discussed earlier that towards the bottom of this painting, I wanted it to be a little blurry, a little less focused or in detail, and this was a great way to achieve that. So this may take some practice, especially if you've never done wet on wet blending before, but just have fun with it and just know that worst case, and the best part of acrylic as well, is you can go over any areas you don't like. So if you prefer to do this another way, it doesn't turn out, you can cover over it with that original base charcoal and start again. Now what I want to do here is I'm going to take my extra small liner brush and that highlight gray, and I'm just going to go ahead and refine some areas a little bit further and add just a touch of detail. I don't want to go too far with this, but I did think it was a little bit unfinished looking. So when I took a step back from my painting, the wet on wet blending worked perfectly. However, the larger brush just left things feeling unfinished. So by adding in these little tiny hairs with my extra small liner, it just kind of keeps the cohesion between the top part of this painting being very detailed, very refined. I felt it kind of matched a little bit better. So please feel free to omit this if you like the way your wet on wet blending worked and the larger filbert, and you're happy with this. Consider your painting pretty well finished. But if you're like me and you want it to be a little bit more refined, you can go in with this extra small and just add in some wayward hairs. Now you will notice in some areas like this area here, I am adding in that really dark shadow color, which was Mars Black and a touch of titanium white. I am coming in and adding some wayward hairs with that shadow as well. So I'm not just adding in some refining with the highlights, I'm actually coming in and darkening some areas as well to create that depth and that look that I'm going for. So this last step in the painting is what I call the touch-ups and the final little marks that we're going to add to this painting. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that I blend this white neck area to the darker underside. And I'm going to do that using my extra small liner brush and my titanium white paint. And I'm just going to go ahead and add in some wayward wispy hairs over top. Otherwise, it may look really chunky and separate. So I do want to do some overlapping and really combine these sections together. Now, I also will add in at the very end any final highlights that I feel are necessary, and this could be around the entire portrait, the face, the neck, the shoulder, wherever I feel my paint has dried a little bit dark, and acrylic does sometimes dry a little bit darker than we anticipate. I'm going to go around the entire subject and just find areas that may need a little bit of a touch-up. So adding in a highlight, adding in a whisker, adding in a catchlight, whatever you think your portrait needs, you take a step back, put it on the wall, on an easel, take a step back, take a look at your painting, and really see what this painting needs. And for me, for this particular painting and tutorial, I thought that this fur section down on the bottom dried a little bit dark, and those highlights got a little lost. So I'm taking a lighter gray and just adding in some extras over top very selectively. But this stage in the painting will be entirely based on you, your preferences, and your painting. And last but not least, don't forget to sign your artwork. Whether it's on the front or the back is entirely up to you, but go ahead and put your signature. All right, and there you have it. There is the finished painting of this gorgeous gray and white cat named Simba. I truly hope you enjoyed painting alongside me today. A big shout out to our channel sponsors, Chartpak, Grumbacher, and Molotov for sponsoring my content here on YouTube. And of course to you, thank you for being members of our wonderful community and your support with these exclusive tutorials. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.